So today we're going to be starting working on this practice test 1, and we're going to be talking about strategy while we work through some portions of the test. If you've taken it before, you know the layout of the test. We've got a reading section, a writing and language section, math with no calculator section, and a math with calculator section. So our first section is our reading section. So let's take a look just at the layout here. So reading is 65 minutes and it has 52 questions. So you get a little over a minute, about a minute and 15 seconds per question. So that is a pretty tight amount of time, particularly with the length of the passages. So as we can see here, and we're going to talk about the annotations I've made here, usually between like 500 to 700 words. That's a not insignificant length for a passage. So the types of passages you're going to see, you'll have one literature passage. So that's going to be any type of fiction, usually a portion of a novel or a short story. Here we can see from our blurb, our title is The Strangeness of Beauty from 1920. So that's our literature portion. That's the only fiction you're going to see on the test, is that literature passage in your reading portion. So everything else is going to be nonfiction. We can see here, you have soft science passages, so sociology, essays, stuff like that, but you also have hard science. So you'll see stuff like biology, chemistry, things like that. You'll also see history. So here we can see this would be a biology and a chemistry passage. And then towards the end, you should have, yes, the paired passages. So this one is in total about the length of a regular passage combined. So each of the individual passages, passage 1 and passage 2, are about half the length. So let's talk about general strategy. So like I just mentioned, the length of these passages is not insignificant. It takes up a lot of time, very valuable time, to read through these passages. And when you're reading through the passages, you're not answering questions. So a very common problem that students have when taking the SAT, especially the reading portion, is running out of time, not being able to answer all the questions, even if they're doing a really good job, even if they are feeling confident about their ability to answer them, just not having enough time. So part of taking the SAT is understanding how to maximize your time to approach the questions and how to work most efficiently. So how to get the best results for your time. So that's what we're going to talk about today. For the reading passage, you want to, for the reading section, you want to approach it on a passage by passage basis. So if you know that you're really strong with like the hard sciences, you know if you have a chemistry or a biology passage, you're going to do great with that. You want to look through and find those first. Usually the difference is not strong enough that students feel the need to like seek out their best passages first. You can usually go just passage by passage as it's laid out. But when you're doing that, you want to be looking at what types of questions you have. In fact, that's the first thing you want to do. The common sense way to approach it, usually how students approach it that haven't discussed strategy, is to start with reading the passage and then move on to the questions. So that's the way the test is laid out, right? We've got our passage first, then our questions. But like we just discussed, reading that passage takes a lot of time. And in order to answer all of the questions without knowing what they're going to ask, you really have to pay attention to every detail of the passage. That requires more time and more effort, which is going to make you less efficient overall. So with our general strategy, instead of starting with our passage, we want to start by looking at our questions. So before we get into our passage, let's start by looking through our questions, and we're going to talk about the types of questions that we're going to see. So going through here, question 1, which choice best describes what happens in the passage? So this is a very general question, and it's about the passage as a whole. So we can also see this in passage 2. which choice best describes the developmental pattern of the passage. So when you see a question like this, the questions are kind of on a spectrum from more detail oriented to more general. These are the more general questions. It's best to skip these and come back to them because the reading approach we want to take is going to address the details first. So these are the kinds of questions we want to skip and come back. Looking at number 3, as used in line 1 and line 65, directly most nearly means. So this kind of question is asking us about the use of vocabulary and context. This is on the far end of the detailed part of the spectrum. So this is a very specific question about a very small portion of the passage. It's going to be pretty quick and pretty direct for us to answer. So questions like number 3 are the kinds you want to do first. You want to prioritize things like vocabulary and detail-oriented questions. Now let's look at number 4. Which reaction does Akira most fear from Chi? So these two names are characters in the passage, but that's not important for the time being. What we can see here is this is paired with number 5, which says, which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? So these types of questions usually require a little bit of digging, okay? You're gonna have to orient yourself in the passage, but there's a specific way we can approach these. So looking at how number 4 is laid out, which reaction does Akira most fear from Chi? That's a pretty interpretation-based question. It is not a yes or no question. We can't, it's not as direct as something, say, in like question 3, where we have a specific sentence, or rather 2 specific sentences to look at. This is a pretty open-ended question asking us to interpret what these 2 characters feel about it. So usually that would require a lot of looking for appropriate context, a lot of looking for appropriate information, and trying to synthesize our own answer based on that. So we do want to keep that skill set, but instead of having to dig through the entire passage looking for what we need to know, we can start with number 5. Because instead of having to dig through the whole passage, they've already given us 4 specific spots to look. So they've done the digging for us. Now we just have to consider that information and see which of those 4 pieces of the passage answers number 4. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but these types of paired questions, and we'll see another one attached to this passage, have a specific way to approach them that is going to make your job easier. It's going to save you some time and some effort. All right, let's go to number 6. So number 6 is an example of a more open-ended, interpretation-based question that does not have a paired evidence question. So in the passage, Akira addresses Chi with. So this is asking us about how one character interacts with another. They have not given us a part of the passage to look at. They don't give us any line numbers. They don't give us any context. They just have this question about how we interpret these 2 characters interact. So this is one we want to skip and come back to, because this is one we're going to have to dig through the passage, identify the information, and synthesize an answer. So this is one to come back to because it's not very detail-oriented. But if we look at, for example, number 7, the main purpose of the first paragraph, this one is a little bit more approachable. So specifically, because it's given us, it's zeroed in on where we need to look. So the digging is going to be pretty minimal. We know we're looking at the first paragraph. If it's asking us about the main purpose, that's going to require a bit of interpretation, but the context that we're looking at is going to be pretty easy for us to analyze that, because, especially for this passage, this is the entirety of our first paragraph, only 4 lines. So that's going to be pretty easy to dig through for us to synthesize and analyze to come up with the main purpose. So number 7 is one we want to prioritize. Also number 8, which again is a vocabulary and context question. So that's asking us about the use of the word form in line 2. Then we get to 9 and 10, which are two more paired evidence questions. So we've got number 9. Why does Akira say his meeting with Chi is a matter of urgency? Line 32. So this one is a little bit more approachable even than the last paired evidence question we saw, because they've given us a specific line to look at for our initial question. It's also a little bit more detail oriented. We don't really have to do as much interpreting, as much analysis. We just have to find the reason that this character is referring to. And we want to look for it in these parts of the passage laid out in question 10. So this is the kind of analysis we want to apply when we start with our questions. In our general strategy, we start with our questions, we look through, and we start prioritizing what's going to be the most approachable, what's going to be the quickest to answer, what's going to take the least amount of work, what's going to go fastest, what are you most likely to get right? Because we want to take those questions you're most likely to get right and essentially put points on the board. Because there's going to be trickier questions, ones that are going to take a little bit of consideration. We want to work through those, but we want to get the easy ones out of the way first. So this is what we're looking through. Our first step is looking through these questions and prioritizing certain ones. So once we've prioritized those questions, we've got a game plan. We know how we want to approach them. Now we want to annotate our text. On the SAT, you're going to be allowed to write on the test booklet. It's a paper booklet. You can write all over it. So this is just an example, a pretty minimal example. You want to write even more than what I've, but what you want to do is draw yourself a roadmap of how to read the text. So, for example, I've highlighted the background information. So that just tells us a little bit about when the story was written, when it's set, and also it gives us a little bit of background information about the characters. So this very small amount of information is sometimes going to come in handy. So knowing that Chi and her daughter Naomi are members of House of Fuji, a noble family. So already we've kind of got a definition of who this character Chi is. We already saw a reference to it in the question. We know about Naomi if that comes up. So we've got that information. We saw the reference to the first paragraph, so we can just circle the first paragraph. So our question was, we wanted to know about the main purpose of the first paragraph. So you can write anything for yourself. Maybe we want to write that we want to know the purpose of the first paragraph. So this word directly and this word form, those are from our 2 vocabulary and context questions. So we want to circle those so we know where they are. Looking at our other parts of the passage. So his voice was soft and refined. You know how children speak, etc., etc. These are all from number 5, our paired evidence question. So we want to underline those specific lines because they're telling us where we're looking in the passage. When we underline them, we don't have to dig through. We don't have to look for them. We already know that they're underlined. We can just automatically go to those parts of the passage and look at them. All right, so for number 6, a passage, in the passage, Akira addresses Chi with. So this is the kind of question that I said we have to dig a little bit for. So we've got this character, Akira, addressing Chi. So we want to look for all the parts of the passage where these 2 characters are interacting. So we can see if we just look kind of generally, we see quotation marks. That's a good kind of indicator that someone's talking to someone. So we can see Chi, Akira, just in general, we can make a bracket, some sort of note for ourselves that we know this is where they're interacting with each other. Same thing down here, where we don't need to know specifically about anything. We don't have to work towards the answer yet. We're just making a roadmap for where to look in this passage. Okay, and then we also have the parts underlined for number 10. So I underlined those in purple. We can see some of them here and one down here. So all of these things are telling us where to look and where the important information is. So we do this because, like I said earlier, to read through the whole passage and pay attention to every detail going to take a lot of effort, and it's going to take a lot of time. What we just did right now is we essentially are cutting out all the fluff, all the extra information we don't have to pay attention to, and we've narrowed it down to what is going to help us answer these questions. So let's start going through these. So 1 and 2 we can come back to. Let's start with number 3. As used in line 1 and line 65, directly most nearly means. So we can look at our options here. Frankly, confidently, without mediation, with precision. So when we approach a vocabulary question, we want to look at these in context, okay? So when we look at them in context, we usually just want to read the sentence that contains them. So when we read that sentence, usually you can get a sense of it on your own based on that reading. If not, if you're still not entirely sure, you want to create a general idea of a definition. It doesn't have to be an exact definition of what you think they're saying, but a general sense of what they're trying to say. And we can compare that to our answers here. So the reason we want to compare our concept of the answer to these options is because this word in certain contexts is going to mean all of these answers. But we only want to think about one context, the context of our passage. So when we define it based on the meaning we see in the text and compare it to our answer options, we have eliminated the possibility that they can be using a synonym, using a homophone, anything like that, because we are basing it on the meaning in the text and not strictly what the word is. So let's look at our context here. Line 1 and line 65 for directly. All right, so here came directly, breaking all tradition, was at it, has he followed form, etc., etc. So Kira came directly, and then for line 65, I asked directly because the use of a go-between takes much time. All right, so this second line, second sentence especially, we see that going directly means that he didn't use a go-between. So based on that, we can make a general idea of what they're trying to say when they use this word directly. So direct, unlike the verb to direct or anything like that, means like to come straight there. So he went straight there, and we know that he is not using a go-between. So we don't have to narrow it down too much, but let's compare those ideas, that he went straight there and he didn't have anyone go for him, he didn't have a go-between. We can compare that to our definitions. So looking at our potential definitions, frankly. So frankly is an example of an answer that is not sufficiently correct, because you're going to have answer options that are the opposite of what you're looking for. So they're obviously totally wrong. They go against everything you saw in the text. You know they're definitely wrong. But there are some that are going to be just incorrect. They're not going to be obviously wrong. They're not going to fly in the face of what you see in the text, but they're just going to be a little bit different than what you think it should be. And this is a great example where, frankly, our word frankly, we don't have enough evidence to support that. So if there's not enough evidence, we can eliminate it. So we can eliminate frankly. And this is a great kind of basis to narrow down your options, is to see what can we eliminate. Confidently. So confidently could possibly work, but again, not enough evidence. It doesn't mention a go-between. It doesn't talk about going directly there, without mediation and with precision. So precision, we don't have any discussion of it being precise. That doesn't quite fit our context. Without mediation. So mediation, we have a very strong piece of evidence to support this, because mediation is, just like that word we saw in the text, a go-between. So he said he didn't use a go-between. So that means he didn't use mediation. He did it without mediation. So C is our correct answer. So we want to have our idea of the word based on what we see in context, and we want to compare that to our potential answers. Eliminate what is definitely wrong and what there's not quite enough evidence to support. So we can approach number 3 like that. Moving on to 4 and 5. So let's look at again, we're starting with our evidence for 4 and 5, and we're trying to answer this question. Which reaction does Akira most fear from Chi? So we already have outlined in the text here what we want to look at. And we are considering what reaction does Akira most fear from Chi. So a note about how these questions are phrased. This is intentionally designed to be misinterpreted because the use of these two names, Akira and Chi, is specifically directed so we have to think about what our character Akira is thinking, not what our character Chi is thinking. Because there's a lot in this passage, if we dig into that fluff, everything we cut out, about what Chi is thinking, but we want to focus on what Akira is thinking. So we have to pay strict attention to what characters the question is directing us to consider. So starting with line 33 and considering the reaction that Akira most fears from Chi. So tells us his voice was soft and refined. Looking at that piece of evidence, we don't get any indication of what reaction he fears. So we can eliminate this. Moving on to lines 49 through 51. So we can eliminate A, 49 through 51. You know how children speak so earnestly, so hurriedly, so endearingly about things that have no importance in an adult's mind. Okay, so that might seem like it's applicable, right? He's speaking hurriedly, earnestly, endearingly, but again, this is Chi. This is the thought process of Chi. We aren't considering Chi's reaction. We want to know what Akira is thinking. So we can eliminate this option. We can eliminate B. All right, moving on to C, which is line 63 through 64. So right here. Please don't judge my candidacy by the unseemliness of this proposal. So if we dig into the context a little, we can see that this is Akira speaking, and it's Akira speaking to Chi. So we have a request that Chi doesn't judge the candidacy by the unseemliness of his proposal. So if he's asking Chi not to do something, that's a good indication that this is fear of a reaction, particularly if it's about this proposal. So we can keep C, but let's double check with our final option to see if we can eliminate that as well. So line 71 through 72, eager through face. All right, 71 through 72, eager to make his point. He'd been looking her full in the face. All right, so we get a sense of how he's acting. He's eager. We get a sense of what he's doing, looking her full in the face. We don't get a sense of what he doesn't want, what he fears, right? So we can eliminate this option. We can eliminate D. Even if we aren't entirely sure what our answer for 4 is yet, we know that C is the evidence that we're looking for because it's the only thing that could be applicable. It's the only thing giving us relevant information about what he does not want or what he fears. So looking at that again, please don't judge my candidacy by the unseemliness of this proposal. So we've got a sense of what he's trying to say. And now we want, like with our vocabulary questions, we want to get a meaning in our own words to compare our options with. So it directly states in the text that he doesn't want his candidacy be judged on the unseemliness of his proposal. So unseemliness means impoliteness, rudeness, not or uncouthness. So he doesn't want to be judged based on his lack of etiquette, something to that extent. So we've got that idea. Let's compare that to our options here. So we've got A, she will consider his proposal inappropriate. So the use of that word inappropriate fits pretty exactly with unseemly. So he's afraid of being judged unseemly. So let's hold on to A and see what else we can eliminate. B, he will mistake his earnestness for immaturity. So earnestness and immaturity, we don't have any references to those in our piece of evidence. We did see that elsewhere in the text, but again, we want to ignore everything that is we haven't already selected. That the SAT is going to try and use different parts of the text to be intentionally misleading. But we have to cut out the fluff and just focus on what we know is the appropriate context to consider. So we don't have any considerations of earnestness or immaturity. We're only focused on unseemliness. C, she will consider his unscheduled visit an imposition. Okay, so the fact that it's unscheduled does factor into the unseemliness, but he's not afraid of being considered an imposition. This is the specific wording we have to look at. So he's not afraid of being considered an imposition. He's afraid of being his proposal being judged. So we can eliminate C as well. And let's look at D. She will underestimate the sincerity of his emotions. So D as well does not fit with our context. So we can go with A as our answer. So these kinds of paired evidence questions, we start with our evidence. We try and narrow it down of what is applicable to our previous question. We can see A, B, and D here didn't have the information that we were looking for about what is feared by this specific character. Then, based on that context, we can kind of come up with our own idea of what the answer should be and compare that to our answers, eliminating whatever does not match. Okay, moving on. So number 6, that's when we want to come back to. Number 7, the main purpose of the first paragraph is to. Okay, so the first paragraph we talked about is pretty brief. Let's look at our answer options. Describe a culture, criticize a tradition, question a suggestion, analyze a reaction. So we can see all of these answer options are formatted the same way. We've got a verb, describe, criticize, question, analyze, and then a something, a culture, a tradition, a suggestion, a reaction. So a good way to approach these, to keep in mind both parts of these answers. Is it describing something? And if we look in the paragraph and it's describing something, we then ask, is it describing a culture? B, is it criticizing something? If yes, then is it criticizing a tradition? Is it questioning something? Is that a suggestion? Is it analyzing something? And is that a reaction? So the format of these questions we can kind of use against themselves. So let's take a look in the first paragraph and see what they're talking about. Okay, let me zoom in here. Akira came directly, breaking all tradition. Was that it? Had he followed form? He asked his mother to speak to his father to approach a go-between. Would she have been more receptive? Okay, so we've got a statement of what Akira did, right? He came directly. Then we have this question. Was that it? It's a little bit of a rhetorical question, and it's asking, had he followed form, had he asked his mother to speak to his father to approach a go-between, would she have been more receptive? All right, so because this paragraph's so short, we can still kind of dig into it a little and not waste too much time. So our central problem is this question. Would she have been more receptive if Akira had not done what's described? Coming directly, not following tradition. If he had asked his parents to speak with, or to get a go-between, would she have been more receptive? So let's take a look at our options to see what fits with what we see there. So describe a culture, criticize a tradition, question a suggestion, analyze a reaction. So let's start with A, describe a culture. Culture is a big part of that first paragraph, where we see they're talking about tradition, the use of a go-between. Based on what we can see, if we read between the lines, we know that culture is kind of the subtext here. But We have to focus on both parts. Describe a culture is not that purpose of the first paragraph, right? We're talking specifically about Akira and what's going on in his personal life. So describing a culture is not that what's going on in that first paragraph. If it had said, in this region of this country, people normally use go-betweens in marriage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and this is the culturally appropriate way to do it, which our character Akira did not do, that would be different. But here we're focusing on the personal lives of these characters. So we can eliminate A. Moving on to B, criticize a tradition. So tradition, again, definitely part of that first paragraph, but the function is not to criticize it. All right, now let's go to C. So kind of the opposite now, questioning. Questioning is a big part of that first paragraph. Was that it? Would she have reacted differently? But what are they questioning? Is it a suggestion? We didn't have any mention of a suggestion there, so we can eliminate C. And let's look at D. Analyze a reaction. So analysis. That might not directly show up. Is there a reaction? Well, our reaction is Chi's reaction, right? Would Chi have been more receptive? So we have this reaction about how receptive Chi was, and we're asking questions about it, trying to figure out what could have been different. So they are analyzing, and it is a reaction. So D fits most closely with what we see in the first paragraph, the main purpose. So D, from that description, doesn't on the surface maybe look like it should fit. Where words like question, culture, and tradition might stand out in those answers, it's important to dig into the meaning of these descriptions and not just fall for buzzwords. Because the SAT is going to do that a lot, where they're going to throw out buzzwords that match something that appears in the text. The answer as a whole does not. Okay. How are we doing with time? 7:34. All right, let's keep going. So looking at number 8, line 2, form, what's nearly means. So again, we want to take that same approach. We go to line 2. We look at form. We read the sentence. Had he followed form, had he asked his mother and father to speak, to approach a go-between, would she have been more receptive? So we're asking about if he had followed form. We've got a description of what that form is, asking to go-between. So go-between, or the form here, a tradition, a custom, something like that. So let's see what our answer options say. So appearance does not fit with what we see there. Custom does fit. Structure, potentially. Nature definitely does not. So when we choose between two strong possibilities, it's good to go back and read through it with our answer options. So if we do that, had he followed custom, had he asked his mother to speak to his father to approach the go-between, or had he followed structure, had he asked his mother to speak to his father to approach a go-between, we can see that custom is a much better fit here. So custom would be our answer. We can eliminate C, structure. All right, let's go to numbers 9 and 10. So number 9 says, why does Akira say his meeting with Chi is a matter of urgency? In line 32. So we want to start looking in our answer options, and we're answering this question. Why is it a matter of urgency? So let's start with lines 39. So important to note here is that the evidence they've laid out for us in this question is divided into 2 parts of this paragraph. So this is one part, and then it's divided into this other part. The important information to answer these is in this paragraph, and we have to pay close attention to which answer option it applies to. All right, so our first answer option, I don't want to trouble you. That does not answer our question. Our second piece of evidence, normally I would approach you more properly, but I've received word of a position I have an opportunity to go to America as a dentist for Seattle's Japanese community. So here's a possible piece of evidence for why he's in a hurry. Like they said in line 32, forgive my disruption, it's a matter of urgency. This is a potential reason why. So let's hang on to that and let's look at our other options. Depending on your response, I may stay in Japan. So that kind of connects. And then our final option, I see I've startled you. So that definitely we can eliminate. So looking at our two possible, the ones we have not eliminated. B, normally I'd approach follow custom, but I have the opportunity to work in America. Or C, depending on your response, I may stay in Japan. So C, depending on your response, I may stay in Japan, does not give us that sense of a time limit. It is pretty open-ended. We don't get a sense of urgency from that statement. But in option B, he does say specifically that he would not have been in a hurry were it not for this opportunity. So we can go with option B, that he has the opportunity to be a dentist in Seattle. And let's look at our answers in number 9. He fears that his own parents will disapprove of Naomi. He worries that Naomi will reject him and marry someone else. He has been offered an attractive job in another country. He knows that she is unaware of his feelings for Naomi. So, based on what we saw, C fits exactly with that piece of evidence. So we can eliminate our other options. He's been offered an attractive job, a dentist position in another country, the United States. Okay, so again, that system allows us to avoid misleading answer options and get straight to the appropriate content. All right, let's finish out the rest of the questions for this passage, and then we can move on to the writing and language. All right, so the ones we've skipped over so far, number 1, number 2, and number 6. So let's talk about number 6 really quickly. In the passage, Kira addresses Chi with affection but not genuine love, objectivity but not complete impartiality, amusement but not mocking disparagement, respect but not utter deference. Okay, so again, very important that we pay attention to the way this question is worded. And Akira addresses Chi. So I've drawn this arrow because that's what we want to pay attention to. One character, Akira, addresses Chi. Because they're going to be talking back and forth, we only want to pay attention to the evidence of Akira talking to Chi. So if we narrow down this context, like we highlighted or I put in brackets earlier, we want to look for Akira talking to Chi. All right, so Chi comes out, Chi glanced beyond him. In the glistening surface of the courtyard, rain-drenched paving stones, she saw his reflection like a dark double. Madam, said Akira, forgive my disruption, but I come with a matter of urgency. So we can read through these few paragraphs and look for our evidence. It says, he straightened and stole a deferential peek at her face. In the dim light, his eyes shone with sincerity. She felt herself starting to like him. Come inside, get out of this nasty night. Surely your business can wait a moment or two. I don't want to trouble you. Normally I would approach more properly, etc., etc. Okay, so we want to dig through this evidence or this context for some evidence. So how does Akira address Chi? So how is he talking to her? Well, we've got the use of the word madam. We've got this deferential peak. We've got the phrase, I don't want to trouble you. Okay, so far, these terms that he's using, we can, and mannerisms that the author is describing, we can use as evidence to answer this. So going on to the next part where they interact. So Akira blushed. Depending on your response, I may stay in Japan. I've come to ask for Naomi's hand. Suddenly, Chi felt the dampness of the night. Okay. We have an understanding. Please don't judge my candidacy by the unseemliness of this proposal. I asked directly because the use of a go-between takes much time. Either method comes down to the same thing, a matter of parental approval. If you give your consent, I become Naomi's Yoshi. Okay. So, and then we've got their discussion, and then we have this, he bowed and left, taking her ease with effortless grace like a cat making off with a fish. Okay, so when we are looking through here, it's interpretation based. So they're not going to tell us directly. We have to observe how this character is acting, make note of it, and analyze that to make our answer. So we can see all of our answer options, again, have the same format. Something, blank, but not blank. So affection, but not genuine love. Objectivity, but not complete impartiality. Amusement, but not mocking disparagement. Respect, but not utter deference. Okay. So option B and option C are red herrings. So they're red herring answer options. They're intentionally misleading because there is evidence to support those if we get our question mixed up. If we think about how Chi, the mom in this story, is thinking of Akira, we could argue for B or C. But that's why I wanted to specify how we read this question. We are not thinking about that. We are thinking about how Akira addresses Chi. So there's nothing to support objectivity. There's nothing to support amusement. We can eliminate those options. Now let's look at A and D. Affection, but not genuine love. Respect, but not utter deference. So we don't really have evidence to support affection. So, but we do have evidence to support respect, right? He bowed, called her madam, he looked at her deferentially, but not genuine love. So we can eliminate A, but not utter deference. So we do know that he was breaking custom, things of that nature. So we can go with D as our answer. Now let's look at 1 and 2. So 1, which choice best describes what happened in the passage? So these questions you want to do last because when you skip around, when we read, like we did here, where we kind of skim, we use our notes, we use context, we use what's said in the questions to find an answer, these bigger picture questions, asking us about the whole passage, might be a little bit more difficult. So if we answer all the other questions, pardon me, if we answer all the other questions first, these are usually a little bit more approachable. So let's look at what our answer options have to say here. A, one character argues with another character who intrudes on her home. B, one character receives a surprising request from another character. C, one character reminisces about choices she has made over the years. D, one character criticizes another character for pursuing an unexpected course of action. All right, so we can see these are laid out in very general terms. So if we can define them a little bit more specifically, we can see whether they're accurate to the text or not. So let's start with A. One character argues with another character who intrudes on her home. So if we're talking about a female character who's having her home intruded upon, that would probably be Chi. So this other character would be Akira. So now we can read the description as Chi argues with Akira, who intrudes on her home. And now we can compare that to what we saw in the text. We go to B. One character receives a surprising request from another character. So we saw the request is about marriage. So one character would be Chi receives a surprising request from Akira. If we go to C, one character reminisces about choices she has made over the years. So this one is far enough off base that I don't think we can even define this with the terms and the names that we've seen in this passage. We can probably eliminate C. Looking at D, one character criticizes another character for pursuing an unexpected course of action. So this one possibly could be Chi criticizes Akira for an unexpected course of action. So let's look at our options here now that we've drawn possible definitions. So A, one character argues with another character. So from what we saw, there is some discussion and some attempt at persuasion, but argument is not what happens in this text. We don't see anything to say that they're yelling or even that they're very strongly disagreeing. So we can eliminate option A. B, one character receives a surprising request from another character. That one fits pretty exactly with what we see. The surprising request is the proposal. She receives that from Akira. And D, one character criticizes another character for pursuing an unexpected course of action. So it does, so this description, unexpected, doesn't quite fit. We know it's not, unseemly, doesn't follow with the usual protocol, but not quite unexpected. And also we don't exactly have criticism, although there is some hesitancy. We don't really see a lot of criticism going on in the text. So again, D does not fit as neatly as B does. So we can go with B as our answer. Now let's go to number 2. Which choice best describes the developmental pattern of the passage? So this term, developmental pattern, you might see terms like this that might not stand out as one that you use a lot, maybe in school or that you've seen a lot before, but looking at the context of the answers, they're a little bit easier to. So we can see a careful analysis of a traditional practice, a detailed depiction of a meaningful encounter, a definitive response to a series of questions, or a cheerful recounting of an amusing anecdote. So this is almost just kind of a very, almost like a genre description. So this, again, we want to look at the format. We have A, careful analysis, detailed depiction, definitive response, cheerful recounting of a traditional practice, meaningful encounter, series of questions, amusing anecdote. So we want to double check both of those parts of the answers. So let's start with A, careful analysis of a traditional practice. So again, we want to define our terms. So the traditional practice would be, what we saw in the text would be a go-between, right, for marriage proposals. So if that's the traditional practice, we can see a careful analysis is not what this story is. This is about personal lives. This is not a careful analysis of a traditional practice. Looking at B, a detailed depiction of a meaningful encounter. So the meaningful encounter would be the proposal. So detailed depiction, that fits pretty directly, so we can hang on to B. Let's go to C, a definitive response to a series of questions. So a series of questions could be what she asks Akira, could be the proposal, but again, we don't have a definitive response, nor is there quite a series of questions. So C doesn't fit enough that we can eliminate it here. I'm looking at D, a cheerful recounting of an amusing anecdote. So anecdote here usually means like a brief story, a small event. This is usually a marriage proposal is not described as an anecdote. So cheerful also, while this story isn't particularly like morose or sad or anything, I wouldn't describe it as cheerful. So we can eliminate D as well. So B would be our correct answer for number 2. So these are a lot easier to, oh, that's a little bit sloppy. These kinds of questions are a lot easier to answer once you've gone through the other questions, because you've got a better sense of what's going on in different parts of the passage. You do a little bit of analysis, you get a good sense of that information without having to read through the whole text. So we just worked through our 10 questions for our first passage. So what can we take away about the reading passage? 1, when we get to our passages, we want to start with our questions. We want to start by reading through our questions and making a game plan, prioritizing certain questions. 2, we want to write on our passages a lot. We want to make ourselves a game plan of how to read through it. We don't want to spend a lot of time reading. We want to use that kind of roadmap, that game plan we've made for ourselves to answer the questions. We want to use process of elimination. We want to take a strategic approach to the questions, and we want to approach our big picture questions first. Okay, so that's an example of how we can approach a passage on our reading section. So this is how you want to go through all of them. As we go ahead, we're going to be working specifically on passages with graphs. We'll look at passages with data. We'll look at our paired passages and how we can adjust for those, but we're going to keep that same general strategy. All right, so I'd like to move on to the writing and language section. Go ahead and let me know in the chat if you have any questions about the reading section, anything you want to revisit. Right now, I'd like to move on to the writing and language. Okay, so our writing and language portion of the test, 35 minutes long. We have 44 questions. This is the least amount of time we have per question on the test. I believe it's roughly like 45 seconds. So not a ton of time per question. Usually that's not as much of an issue as the reading section is, because the reading is less significant in these portions. So with that small amount of time, we do want to be considering how much time we're spending reading, and we do want to make use of our strategies to approach this. So let's look at how this is laid out. So instead of our reading section layout where it's passage, questions, our passage is going to be on the left side, and our questions are going to be on the right side. So they're going to be right next to each other. So you can just kind of go along with the passage as you're going through the questions. The questions are going to be significantly more independent of each other. There's not going to be a lot of comprehensive, big picture questions for you to answer. There's going to be very, very few occasions where you'll have to read the whole passage. So you have a freer hand to skip around. So when you're skipping questions, you want to prioritize the questions you're comfortable with, that are in a format you're familiar with, that you think you're going to get correct, that you think are going to go quickly. So you have a freer hand to apply that throughout this whole section. So you can stick to a passage by passage basis. You don't really need to, though. You can skip all the way through and then come back to the ones you skip. Get the easy ones, the approachable ones out of the way first, so then you can spend your time working through the more difficult ones. So with prioritizing questions, we want to keep in mind the way the questions are distributed, what they're going to look like. So in general, we've got two groups of writing and language questions. Our first group is our more rules-based group, and that's going to be things like punctuation, grammar, sentence structure, usage. So that kind of question is going to have a specific rule that you have to apply. So if you don't know the rules, those questions can be kind of difficult, but there is also a pretty direct solution, and that's learning the rules. So our other type of question doesn't have that direct solution, and that kind of question is more of a rhetorical question. So that's going to be things like developing ideas, relevant information, the structure of arguments, the logical flow of ideas. So those kinds of questions usually are a little bit more interpretive, require a little bit more reading, a little bit more time, but are not those rules-based questions. So if you're a little bit more comfortable with kind of a more open-ended interpretive question, those might be your strong suit. If those are something you have difficulty with, unfortunately, you can't just learn a set of rules, but you can, with practice, they do get a little bit more approachable. So let's start looking through our first passage for this writing and language section. Let's take a look at what kind of questions we might see here. All right, so our first kind of question. Here we're choosing between outdo, defeat, outperform, or outweigh. So this is a usage question. This one might require a little bit of reading, but this is essentially just following our, whether it's an appropriate usage of a certain word. So this is going to be more rules-based. Looking at number 2, which choice provides the most relevant detail? This is definitely a more rhetoric-based question. This is going to require a little bit more reading, a little bit more context, might take a little bit more time. Looking at number 3 and number 4, these are both punctuation-based questions and grammatical structure-based questions. Here we can see the use of our possessive apostrophe. Here we're considering using commas or colons. So knowing the rules for the use of those punctuation makes answering a question like this much more approachable. We're going to be talking about those rules as we go through these classes. Looking at number 5, to make this paragraph most logical, sentence 5 should be placed. So this kind of question, we have to be considering the logical structure of these paragraphs. It's also going to require a little bit more reading because you should be reading the whole paragraph to approach these questions. That's a larger scale for the context than most of these questions. Most of these questions you can do just by reading the sentence that contains them. For a question like number 5, you want to be reading the paragraph. There are going to be certain types of questions where you put paragraphs in order. Those are going to be the only type of questions where you might need to read the whole passage. But number 5 is going to require a little bit more context to answer. All right, moving on to number 6. The writer is considering deleting the underlined sentence. So this, again, more rhetoric-based, going to require a little bit more context and understanding of the underlined portion in context. So this one might be a little bit more time-consuming. Looking at number 7, we're looking for appropriate usage here. And same thing with number 8, we're looking for, or pardon me, that's not a usage question. That's looking at our grammar, what is our form of the verb grammatically correct. Then looking at number 9. So this one, we're looking for the appropriate transition. That's going to require a little bit of reading and interpretation. Number 10 and number 11. So number 10 is about usage. Are we using the appropriate word? Number 11 is about punctuation. So those are two pretty general groups. Within those groups, there are obviously specific grammar rules, specific types of rhetorical questions. I like to use those two general groups because those are kind of usually the two strength sets of students approaching these. Either they'll be more familiar with the grammatical rules or more familiar with kind of general rhetoric or rhetorical questions. All right, so let's go through some of these examples before we move on to the math section. So let's start with number 1. So this kind of question is one where we can just read the sentence that contains this underlined portion and probably have enough information to answer it. All right, given these solutions, as well as the many health benefits of the food, the advantages of Greek yogurt outdo the potential drawbacks of its production. So here we can see for all of our questions, we've got outdo, defeat, outperform, outweigh. All of these kind of have the same flavor of meaning like to surpass, be better than, something like that. Where this kind of statement is not going to have a specific rule going to determine what goes where, but we want to know the general sense of how we use English to compare, well, in this case, compare things. So we're talking about potential drawbacks versus advantages. When we're talking about advantages and disadvantages, or in this case, drawbacks, we usually talk about weighing advantages against disadvantages. So we would say that the advantages outweigh the drawbacks. So while outperform and defeat and outdo could be considered appropriate, they're not our best term to use here. So this kind of question, we want to know about how things are usually written. So a good rule of thumb is what sounds good. That's not the determining factor, but that is a great way to start if you're if you want to start by eliminating some. So for example, defeat and outdo would stand out to me as two that definitely sound unusual or not sound like usual English usage. All right, let's go to number 2. Which choice provides the most relevant detail? All right, so looking at number 2, so number 2 here. So when we're answering specific questions, so the dark rectangle of the question is going to correspond to the dark rectangle in the passage. For something like number 5, where it says sentence 1, 2, and 3, that's going to correspond to the brackets, 1, 2, and 3. Just a note on how to read these. All right, so looking at number 2, we want to provide the most relevant detail. This is probably going to require a little bit of context. So let's read through our question here. They can add it to livestock feed as protein, as a protein supplement, and people can make their own Greek-style yogurt at home by straining regular yogurt. Okay, so reading a little bit more of our context here. To address the problem of disposal, farmers have found a number of uses for acid whey. All right, so what we just had to do here is expand our context. So if you read through the sentence and that's not enough information, you usually want to add the sentence before and the sentence after. You can keep expanding from there. So in this case, reading the sentence before gives us enough of the context. So we want a relevant detail. So relevant detail means we're supporting what's already been stated or what's being argued. So in our sentence before, to address the problem of disposal, farmers have found a number of uses for acid whey. So number 4, it says they can add it to livestock feed as a protein supplement, and people can make their own Greek-style yogurt at home by straining regular yogurt. All right, so our context, what is getting set up here, is uses for acid whey. In our sentence, it says it can be added to livestock feed as a protein supplement, but then it says people can make their own Greek-style yogurt at home. There's no discussion in the second part of the sentence about acid whey, about this use of acid whey. So we can eliminate option A. So we want the second use that these farmers came up with for acid whey. All right, so let's look at B, C, and D. All right, so they can use it as a protein supplement and convert it into gas to use as fuel in electricity production. All right, so B fits pretty closely. Let's take a look at C and D. They can use it as a protein supplement, while sweet whey is more desirable as a food additive for humans. All right, so that doesn't give us another use that the farmers have for acid whey. And D, they can use it as a protein supplement, which provides an important element of their diet. Again, doesn't give us that other use because these farmers found a number of uses. So B is our correct answer. All right, let's go on to number 3. All right, so number 3, we look for this black rectangle, can pollute waterways. All right, so we want to read the sentence in question. If it is improperly introduced into the environment, acid whey runoff can pollute waterways, depleting the oxygen content of streams and rivers as it decomposes. Okay. Okay, so for this question, we're considering, should we be using a possessive apostrophe? Should we be using a plural possessive apostrophe? And should we be using can, could, or has? All right, so let's start with this, this term I've been using, possessive apostrophe. So waterways with an apostrophe, so like we have it here, would mean waterway. A waterway, so a river, a lake, whatever, has something. Waterways, apostrophe S, means a waterway has something. So that would be like if I was talking about this class and I said Greg's SAT class. So when I say Greg's, that means the SAT class is mine. It's the one I'm teaching. So here, a good use or a good test of whether that's appropriate is to see if whatever has a possessive apostrophe is in fact possessing something, if it has something. So looking at our context, if it is improperly introduced into the environment, acid whey runoff can pollute waterways. So here the waterways aren't possessing anything. They don't have anything. If we take it out we're talking about a plural, waterways, more than one waterway, which makes sense in our context. So we can eliminate the ones with the possessive apostrophe. We can eliminate B, we can eliminate D. Now, our question is, do we want can or do we want could have? So this is the grammatical conjugation that we're looking at. So a good rule of thumb is you want to match it with the other parts of the sentence. So can is like a hypothetical, right? It's a potential. It can happen. Could have, also hypothetical, but it's in the past. So our sentence is structured as if it is improperly introduced, it can pollute waterways. If it is improperly introduced, it could have polluted waterways, doesn't match with the other parts of the sentence. So if it is improperly introduced into the environment, acid wave runoff can pollute waterways, depleting the oxygen content of streams and rivers as it decomposes. So option A matches, if we read through it with option C, if it is improperly introduced into the environment, acid wave runoff could have polluted waterways, depleting oxygen content of streams and rivers as it decomposes. So that would be referring to a specific point in the past, which we don't have in this passage. For number 3, option A is our correct option. Okay, moving on to number 4. Here we're considering the use of a colon, a comma, or 2 commas here. Also a semicolon. All right, so yogurt manufacturers, food scientists, semicolon, and government officials are also working together to develop additional solutions for reusing whey. So here we have a list: yogurt manufacturers, food scientists, and government officials. So when we have a list that includes the word and, so usually if there's 3 or more parts of our list, we use something called the Oxford comma. So yogurt manufacturers, food scientists, comma, and government officials. So a semicolon here would not be appropriate. So we can eliminate option A. Option B also would not be appropriate because we should not be using a colon. I'll talk about semicolon and colon use in a second. So we can either go with C or D. C is our appropriate answer because this second comma here interrupts the flow of our sentence. And government officials is one term. It's another unit on our list and should not be separated from government officials. We can eliminate D. Let's quickly talk about the use of semicolons and colons on the writing and language sections. So colons look like that. The simplest way to describe them is that they introduce a list. So you say, so you use a colon and then you list some things. And that's often how it is used. But more specifically, a colon introduces specific examples or specifics after a general description. So sometimes that specific example will just be one thing, one person. So it doesn't have to be a list of multiple things. There's a general description and then the specific example or specifics of that description. A semicolon is used to link 2 very closely related terms. So a good rule of thumb is that if a semicolon is used, it could be replaced with a period, and the 2 terms would function as sentences on their own. So that's a good test to run about semicolons, but also they're used to separate items of a list that contain commas. So for example, if I was talking about the dinners that I had this week, and I said I had spaghetti, meatballs, and salad. And that's my first item of the list. Because it contains commas, I can't have a comma to separate it from my next unit, so I'd have to have a semicolon, and then I could have the next one, which would be something like rice, chicken, sorry, my handwriting's getting a little sloppy, rice, chicken, and mashed potatoes or something. And because this also has commas, then I would separate it for my next term with a semicolon. So that's one way that you'll see semicolons used, where maybe the replacing it with a period rule wouldn't entirely work. That's something to check, that if your list contains groups with commas in them, they should be separated by semicolons. But otherwise, you can usually test whether it's appropriate by seeing if you can replace it with a comma or with a period. All right, so we've got about 18 minutes left. I'd like to come back and revisit some of this writing and language portion, but but that might have to be for next class, because I would like to get to the math section before the end of class today. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to the math. We'll be revisiting this next class. But please let me know in the chat if you have any questions about the writing and language section or any of the questions that I skipped over. So let's go ahead and go to the math section. So our first section here, math with no calculator. 25 minutes, you have 20 questions. So those 20 questions, we can see it says here, 20 questions, and you have multiple choices. You're choosing the best answer. For 16 through 20, you have to grid it in on your answer sheet. So we can see, for example, 1 through 15 is going to have A, B, C, and D as your options to choose from. Moving down to 16 through 20, there is no multiple choice listed here. You have to grid them in, like we see here, but you don't have options to choose from. So a lot of students find that a little bit intimidating, but we'll talk about that in a second. So with these math sections, unlike reading and writing and language, obviously for the math, there's no passage. There's no reading passage that all the questions are oriented towards. So again, you have a very free hand to skip questions and come back to them. When you're skipping questions, you want to emphasize your strengths. What do you feel most confident with? What subjects have you had the best results with when you practice? Stuff like that. Which questions look like they're going to be the fastest? You want to go through the whole section, and you want to get those questions out of the way first. If you get to a question and you don't immediately know how to do it, a good rule of thumb, if you don't immediately have a plan how to do it, even if it might take you a minute to work through it, skip it and come back to it. Because those questions where you immediately know what to do, you can get those out of the way really quickly, and that's going to save you more time. You're going to build up extra time that you can spend on those more difficult, more time-consuming problems. So when you skip through problems, when you skip through this section, it's important to know that there's progression of difficulty. So that means questions are going to get harder as they go along. So for example, question 1 is probably going to be our easiest multiple choice question. As we go along, it'll get more difficult. And number 15, our last multiple choice question, is going to be our most difficult multiple choice question. However, this resets once we get to the grid in portion. So number 15, our hardest multiple choice question, is followed by number 16, which is going to be our easiest grid in question. So when you're skipping through, you're applying our strategy, you're emphasizing your strengths, you have run out of questions on the multiple choice that are easy and approachable. Instead of coming back to the multiple choice and trying to work through the more difficult questions, skip ahead to the grid in portion and try and get some of these out of the way. Because 16 is probably going to be much more approachable than the questions you have left on the multiple choice questions. And you want to get these out of the way, because once time starts to wind down, once you don't have a ton of time left, you are going to have the option to guess on the multiple choice question. But you don't have the option to guess here because you don't have multiple choices to choose from. So for those multiple choice questions, you can always use process of elimination. You can always guess. You have a 1 in 4 chance of guessing correctly. but you don't really have that on the grid in question. So you want to try and get those out of the way because you can run out of time and just guess in those last few seconds for the multiple choice. Obviously, we want to avoid that situation, but it's important to incorporate that in our strategy. So let's go ahead and look through some of our questions. We can talk about the kinds of questions we're going to see and maybe work through a few examples. So starting off with number one, this is probably some of our most basic algebra we're going to see on this test. They give you a function, they give you a variable, and they ask you to solve for x. So for this, we just have to plug in k into our equation, and we get x minus 1 over 3 equals 3. So we multiply both sides by 3, we get x minus 1 equals 9. So we add 1 to both sides, and we get x equals 10. So very direct solution. This is kind of the foundation on which they're going to build more and more complicated questions. So this basic format of equation, variable, solution gets a little bit more complicated and kind of recurs throughout the math section. All right, let's look at number 2. So here we have the use of imaginary numbers. So this kind of question doesn't come up a lot, but it does come up consistently. You're probably going to see 2 or 3 imaginary question numbers, maybe not even that many, maybe just 1 or 2, where they're either going to be pretty simple, like we can see this one, or a little bit more complicated, which we'll be seeing later on. But this one, which is the sum of 7 plus 3i and added to negative 8 plus 9i. So this is a complex number. We have a real number paired with an imaginary number. So when we're adding or subtracting, imaginary numbers, we just do real number with real number. So that'd be 7 plus negative 8. An imaginary number with imaginary number. So that would be 3i plus 9i. And we get negative 1 and 12i. So that would be our answer here, negative 1 plus 12i. So that's a pretty straightforward answer. If you don't know about imaginary number or complex numbers and how we add or subtract them, there's not really a way around this problem. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. It's just that basic rule for adding and subtracting complex numbers. All right, let's look at number 3 and number 4. So these are kind of almost two sides of the same coin, where this is testing our ability to interpret word problems and translate them into algebra, or vice versa. So looking at number 3, Armand sent M text messages each hour for 5 hours. Tyrone sent P text messages each hour for 4 hours. Which of the following represents the total number of messages? So students seeing these kinds of questions for the first time sometimes struggle with it, just because it's kind of SAT specific. You don't see a ton of questions like this elsewhere. So if you see something like this and you're struggling to process how it works, a good way to approach it is to plug in numbers for the variables. So if we just plug in 1 for M and 2 for P, we would know that 1 text message every hour for 5 hours would be 5, and 2 text messages every hour for 4 hours would be 8. So we'd say 5 plus 8 equals 13. So if you plug in 1 for M and 2 for P in each of these options, whichever one gives you 13, it's going to be the correct answer. So notice I picked different numbers, so that's important. You don't want to pick the same option, because as we can see in C and D, they have interpreted that. They are waiting for you to mix up the variables, because that's a pretty common accident to make. But we know that 5, it would be 5 times M plus 4 times P, give us 13. So it should be C for number 3. All right, so let's keep moving through here. So number 4 is almost the opposite. instead of giving us a description and we have to make an equation, they've given us an equation and we have to interpret what is the meaning of a part of this equation. So 108 minus 23D equals P. D is the number of phones left. D is the number of days she has worked that week. So a really useful really useful starting point for any interpretation of an equation is to look at the format. So we know our linear format, or our slope-intercept format as it's referred to, is y equals mx plus b. So b is our y-intercept. So y-intercept, or the value when x is 0. M is our slope, or rate of change. We have an input, and we have an input, and we have an output. So we'll also see other formats, but right now we can recognize that this is a linear equation. So looking at it here, we can rearrange it to say P equals negative 23D plus 108. So it matches with our slope-intercept format. So 108 would be our B, our y-intercept. So our y-intercept would be where our x is 0, or our input is 0, and D is our input. D, the number of days she has worked that week. So when D is 0, P is 108. P is the number of phones left. So when she has worked 0 days that week, she has 108 phones to fix. So that means our answer is B. She starts each week when she has worked 0 days that week. So when she starts with 108 phones to fix. All right, let's keep working through here. All right, so number 5, we're adding and subtracting complex terms like this, where we just have to understand matching terms. So we've got x squared y, so we look over here for x squared y. We've got 3y squared, we look over here for y squared. We have 5xy squared, we look over here for xy squared. And they all go together. So we just subtract and add, or here we're subtracting, so we would just do that with our like terms. Okay, let's move on. So how are we doing with time? 7 minutes left? Okay. So number 6. So here, again, we're given an equation, and we're told to, based on the model, what's the estimated increase in inches of a boy's height each year? So here we want to look at the definitions of the variable. Height is h, age is a, between the ages of 3 and 5. So if we wanted to be really technical about this, if you're not sure where to start, you could, because it says ages of 2 through 5, you could plug in 2 and 3, or 3 and 4, or 4 and 5, and you could see what the height is for when they're 3, see what the height is for when they're 4, and then find the difference. But also we know that this is in a linear format, right? Y equals mx plus b, or in this case, h equals 3a, plus 28.6. So if it's asking us about the increase each year, we would want to look for the slope, our rate of change, because our rate of change is how much something increases per each change in input, which would be age, a, years. So m is our slope. So if we follow the format, that means 3 is our rate of change, or the change each year. So for number 6, A would be our answer. Okay, let's move on to number 7. Number 7 is one that a lot of students tell me, this is kind of where students start to see questions that are intimidating. You can see it's number 7, so this is right about halfway through our multiple choice options. So this is a great example of a question that looks intimidating and looks very complicated, but if we read what we have to do, it's actually pretty approachable. So our description says, the formula above gives the monthly payment M needed to pay off a loan of P dollars at R% annual interest rate over N months. All of that information is entirely filler. We don't need to know any of that. We just need this last sentence. which of the following gives P in terms of M, R, and N? So this is a pretty common way of phrasing a question or an instruction that you'll see on the math section a lot. Find something in terms of something else. So when it says, which of the following gives P in terms of M, R, and N, that means it's going to have P equals some version of M, R, and N mixed up together in an equation. So just based on that description, even if we don't know how they go together, we can already start to eliminate what does not fit in our answers. So we can see with C and D, we've gotten R, and we've gotten M, but no N. So we want M, R, and N, so we can eliminate D and we can eliminate C. Now we've narrowed it down to A and B. So worst case scenario here, you can guess. And you've narrowed it down to a 50-50 guess, right? You've got, it's like flipping a coin that you could get it correct, which is a pretty good guess. So in a situation where you absolutely don't know, 50-50 guess is better than a 1 in 4 guess. So you want to narrow down your answer options and try and find one answer that you think absolutely has to be wrong, at least. Narrowing it down that way improves your ability to guess. But this question's still pretty approachable. Let's take a look. So we know we want P by itself. This whole fraction here is pretty complex, but P isn't part of this fraction. So for example, if instead it said M equals, let's say, X over Y times P, it would be pretty easy to get P by itself. We would just multiply times the inverse of X over Y. We do Y over X to both sides. And that on one side, it would cancel out, leaving P by itself. And on the other side, we'd have the inverse times M. So we just need the inverse of this big fraction times M. We can see 1 plus R over 1200 raised to the n minus 1 should be on the top. We can see we have that right here. So B should be our correct answer. So this looks intimidating, but as long as we read the question carefully and look at our equation carefully, we should be able to approach it. There's not going to be anything on this test that is impossible to do. All right, let's move on to number 8. All right, so we can see A over B equals 2. So what is the value of 4B over A? So there's multiple ways we can approach a question like this. A good way to do it is just to set up A over B. If it's equal to 2, we can say is equal to 2 over 1. And we can just work with A as equal to 2 and B as equal to 1. So that would mean 4B be 4 times 1 over A, which would be 2. So it should equal 2. That's going to work for whatever variables we plug in that make A over B equal 2, no matter what they are. So our answer is C, 2. All right, well, that brings us to 8:30 for today. Let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Okay, so thanks for watching, and please remember to contact us at info@embracetutoring.com to set up any personalized private tutoring sessions you would like. Stay tuned for future videos, and best of luck with your studies. We definitely encourage you to visit our Instagram as well as TikTok pages if you have any questions along the way. Take care, guys. Best of luck with your studies.